And welcome back to our training. If you have made it this far, then you are indeed well on your way to earning your ladder PhD for the access of residential roofing structures. Our goal for this lesson is to present some compelling reasons for why we should adopt the good ladder use habits we discussed in our ladder sequencing video, because, quite frankly, all humans are not created equal with respect to their grasp on physical realities. Which will bring up our fifth problem / barrier to ladder safety, which is people who do not comprehend the necessity of the rule will lack the proper incentive to follow the rule. And gravity, let's say, isn't someone who is known for their openness to negotiation. Looking back at our list of well-sequenced setup and use procedures, we find that while some of them, like selecting the most appropriate ladder to use at the very best access point, is relatively intuitive. However, there are other rules that might require a little explaining to fully comprehend. We will begin our explanation with sequence step number 5 on positioning the top of our ladder 3 feet above our landing area. A hard and firm rule that we have all heard at some point in our lives, yet very few people can actually explain beyond that it is a documented OSHA compliance regulation standard. But why is 3 feet the optimum height? Why not 2 feet? Why not 4? And if we are forced to choose, as we often are, will we be better off with a little less than 3 feet or a little more? And are there any access situations that we could encounter where this 3-foot rule could be dangerous to follow? So then let's tackle these questions one at a time, but beginning with understanding that most adults, but not all, bend at the waist height that is approximately 3 feet, which would allow most adults, but not all, to keep the majority of their body weight between the side rails. Furthermore, we should also understand the role that roof pitch will play in our safe access posture. Translation: the greater the pitch of the roofing surface, the greater the ladder height requirement. Therefore, the height at which an individual bends at the waist and the pitch of the roof landing surface should be considered for calculating ladder height, which will usually range between 2.5 and 3.5 feet above the eave contact point. And always remember that it is better to err on the side of a little less than what is needed than a little more, for the simple reason that while bending a little lower is something that anyone is capable of, bending a little higher is never an option. That said, let's take a look at some varying ladder height transitions, beginning with 1 foot over our landing area, which we can see is possible but awkward at best. Next, we see a 2-foot transition, which is noticeably better. Now a 3-foot transition. Which is better still for this particular 6-foot tall adult. And finally, at 4 feet, we witness that while our transition away from the ladder looks easy enough, our transition back to the ladder is very awkward because we have simply exceeded the height at which this individual can bend. Okay, that would seem to end the debate on our first question of why 3 feet over our landing represents an optimal height for our transitions, but not so fast, because there is more to this problem than meets the eye. Because true and total compliance with this 3-foot rule combined with our 75-degree angle rule is not possible with any ladder which is only adjustable in 1-foot increments. And this means that on the majority of our access scenarios, we will have to choose either a little less than 3 feet or a little more. And as we have already established, because of the fact that the human body is only capable of bending at a waistline or lower position, the correct answer would always be to choose a little less. All right, then, let's answer our last question on optimal ladder length for safe transitions, which would be, is this 3-foot rule an absolute rule, or are there transition scenarios where setting our ladder at 3 foot above the landing area would be hazardous to our safety? Well, the short answer to this question would be yes. However, that would seem to bring up another question of, if that were true, then why are we not told this by OSHA, the ladder manufacturers, or even in any other ladder safety training program? And the answer to that question is because those sources we just mentioned address generalities on ladder safeties intended for the average user. A rule that is simple, concise, and would apply 95% of the time, and not specifically to our industry. In other words, the kind of people who depend so heavily on ladders that their chances for encountering this hazard is inevitable. Accessing the gable end would be one example of this exception, which is never optimal, yet sometimes represents the best options that we have short of a man lift rental, because some residents have no usable eave, and if done correctly, can definitely represent a safe and reasonable risk. We can witness the ease of this ladder to 12 pitch transition here, where our top rung is positioned at the ridge cap area. And now an attempt at a transition with our ladder at the standard 3 foot above our roofing contact point. Making a safe transition away from and back to your ladder at a gable peak, you will need to understand that your landing area will fluctuate depending upon how aggressive the pitch of the roof is. Which means that in order to calculate appropriate ladder height, we must comprehend that the greater the angle of our access slope, the less the amount of ladder we will require for safe and easy access transitions. Our next 3 foot exception scenario is for any transition to and from the hip ridge and valleys. As we can see with this diagram, the diagonal lines of any pitch roof will have significantly less pitch than the field surface on our main slopes and hip ends, which makes them very attractive points of access for all roof systems that exceed a 7/12 pitch. The problem with the standard 3 foot extension above our landing area for valley access is the same problem as it is for hip ridge access, which is the outside rail will always represent a major hindrance for the completion of a safe and easy transition. A fact that is difficult for most people to envision or consider until it's actually encountered. Here we can see a slightly better decision would be to position your top rung just below your landing area, but the very best choice will require a little education on a couple of ladder accessories, which we will discuss in our next video. The third and final exception to this 3 foot rule that we will present in this video, although I am sure there are more examples, is when we will be using a ladder in conjunction with a pole-style roof ladder for a steep assist transition. Here the product we are using is a GOAT steep assist. However, the same rule would apply to the Ridge Pro, Hip Lock, and even the Ridge Reacher, which is not only endorsed by our qualified opinion, but by the manufacturer themselves, as we can see with this goat demonstration video from the actual product designer. Now have a look from the user's perspective at the point of our transition from our extension ladder to our steep assist ladder. And it's easy to see exactly why a 3-foot extension would not represent a safe access strategy. Our next explanation will be for our 6th sequence step, which is to always position your ladder at a 75-degree angle. A rule that is so important that some ladders have a built-in leveling indicator for assisting in the process of achieving this precise amount of incline. But why 75 degrees? Well, there are many reasons for setting up your ladder at this angle, but none more important than the fact that it represents the most favorable compromise between forward stability at the top of the ladder and shoe stability at its base. Another reason would be that this is the angle by which its duty rating was based on. Therefore, to use your ladder at any angle less than 75 degrees could cause structural damage at a weight which is lower than its stated working load limit. Now let's spend some time with our 10th sequence step, where our focus will be on the wording as much of our weight between the side rails as physically possible, because it is different than what we are told by the manufacturer, which indicates we should keep all of our body weight between the side rails at all times. A rule that our industry is incapable of following, because at some point we will need to transition our body weight around those side rails. And allow me to remind everyone just how careful we must be with this transition, with this accurate portrayal of the fact that it only takes an average of 9 pounds of side pressure to initiate a ladder's lateral movement with a 200-pound body positioned at our landing area. Effectively managing the risk of this transition process will not only require securing the top of our ladder, which we will get to in a minute, but it also means that we will position our foot, which we will leave behind, to the center of our ladder before we make our transition step. Okay then, let's move on to the old rails versus rungs debate for where our hands really belong while using our ladder. Do just a little research and you will find that some believe that sliding your hands along your ladder rails represents the best solution, while others believe that keeping at least one hand secured to the rungs at all times is the wiser choice. Or we could even use some combination of both, but which one really represents the best technique? Well, from a practical perspective, our hand connections serve 2 different purposes. The first of which would be to keep our upper body from losing contact with the ladder, which is also the purpose of the 3 points of contact rule, which we could accomplish by sliding our hands along the rails, which, barring a misstep, would always provide us with 3 points of contact. But the second purpose is for slip recovery, just in case we do experience that misstep. And for that, our best odds are for both hands, or even one hand engaged with the horizontal rungs, which will always serve as a better means of body weight control than one hand, or even both hands wrapped around the rails. And if that information doesn't convince you of what the correct answer is, then please explain to me why more people choose to complete their pull-up exercises by holding on to the horizontal bar rather than the vertical post. Oh, I don't know. Could it have anything to do with the physical properties of body control? That said, now we can move on to the virtues of securing our ladders to its upper resting point. A very wise investment of time and effort that, from what I have witnessed, isn't all that common in our profession. yet the returns that this provides in safety is immeasurable. Now, there are those who incorrectly believe that some of our access situations do not allow for this process. However, make no mistake that this is something that, with a few basic tools and a little forethought, we should always be capable of completing. So, why is this securing the top of our ladder so important? Well, from the tests that we have run, we've discovered that it only takes 9 pounds of lateral pressure to start a ladder slide motion along a guttered surface. And that would be with a 200-pound body resting at the eave line, which at a minimum is basically enough to make our transitions to and away from our roof surface, but that doesn't leave much of a margin for error. Now let's consider the fact that if it only takes 9 pounds of pressure to begin the slide of an occupied ladder, then how much wind pressure would be required to blow a ladder down? And depending upon the weight and length of the ladder, that answer ranges anywhere from a few pounds to just a few ounces. But what should we do in those pesky circumstances where we find no connection point for our ladder? Well, that is a question that we will answer on our next lesson on ladder accessories. So let's now move on to our last sequence step, which is definitely one of the most important for keeping your ladder from slipping out of place. And that would involve the amount of pressure that we are allowed to place on the top portion of our ladder that extends beyond our landing area. The obvious answer, of course, would seem to be the least amount of pressure needed to transition to and from the roofing surface. And this in general represents a pretty good mantra to follow. But trades professionals like you and I will need to understand a little more about this to provide for our long-term safety needs. So let's begin with the question of where we should transfer our body weight from. Because as we have established earlier, ladders that are only adjustable in 1-foot increments will seldom deliver the perfect rung placement to transition from. What this means is that we will be faced with two, let's say, less than ideal choices because both of them come with a modicum of risk. In other words, transfer your weight from the ladder rung below the eave and we must accept the risk associated from a giant stride. Transfer our weight from above the eave and we accept the risk associated with the application of a kickout force at the ladder's base. Now, most of us, whether we accept it or not, have been programmed with numerous incorrect absolutes when it comes to ladders. Like, never use your ladder on a deck. Never use your ladder on an inclined surface. And of course, never step on a rung positioned above your landing area. However, there are in fact exceptions to all three of these rules, which, by the way, are all directly related to how your ladder is secured at its base. Because on occasion, sometimes we will have no other choice than to place our ladder on a deck surface. Sometimes the best choice is to place your ladder on an inclined surface. And sometimes transitioning from the rung above the landing area is our best option. So now that we have covered the most pressing explanations looming around standard setup and use sequencing, let's get into problem number 6 of our training, which is how to deal with some of the not so standard access problems that we will encounter on occasion. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce the double pull, a technique that is considered so dangerous that it has been sanctioned by many companies as a job-terminating level offense, and no doubt for good reason. But before we go any further, let's define a double pull for those who have not encountered it yet, which is essentially the act of using a ladder to access one level of roofing and then pulling that ladder up or carrying up a second ladder to set up and use on that single-story roofing surface to access a higher level roofing surface. So, are you starting to see why employers in general are not in favor of this particular access technique? Yeah, me too. But the real conundrum here is centered around two conflicting yet undeniable facts for which it represents, that are a risk multiplier that we should do our very best to avoid, and B, the only means for multi-story access on some residential structures. So, how exactly should we deal with this problem of most of our jobs requiring access and some access requiring a double pull? Well, finding out what your employer's official policy is on this would be a pretty good place to start. However, ultimately, we will deal with this risk in the exact same manner as we should deal with any other risk, which is by making a wise decision to either avoid it, reduce it, transfer it, or if we are in fact physically capable, accept it for what it is. If the situation will allow for it, we could choose to avoid a double pull just by having access to a man lift, a drone, or even a multi-story ladder. However, man lifts are expensive, drones don't have hands, and multi-story ladders don't always offer a solution for double pull avoidance. So if nothing else, let's all remember that no job is worth an injury. Therefore, sometimes the best decision is to just avoid the risk altogether. Or better yet, consider your options for another solution. Reducing the risk of a double pull is definitely something that we could achieve through a method known as rope access, a relatively new process recently added to ANSI Z359 fall protection standards, which combines the best of flexible access and gravity control, all of which can be set up from ground level prior to risk exposure, reducing our potential for a fall from multiple stories to mere inches. Another viable alternative would be to transfer our risk to somebody who is much better suited and prepared to deal with the dangers of a double pull, like the ladder assist industry. And yes, if the additional risk of a double pull is relatively benign based on the situation, your tools, your abilities, your knowledge, and the blessing of your employer, then accepting that risk could represent a reasonable option. Now, let's conclude this lesson with some access dialogue about A-frame structures, or basically any access situation where we are tempted to lay our ladder along a slope with less pitch than our ladder's recommended 75-degree angle, which are not exactly all that common, however, will come up from time to time regardless of which part of the country you find yourself in. The first consideration being the fact that most A-frames are usually in the neighborhood of a 2012 to 3012 pitch, which by the way is not aggressive enough to accommodate your ladder's 4512 standard for safe use. So the very best means of accepting this risk in terms of total accessibility is probably our rope access option. Although if your access needs are limited in scope, they could be met with the appropriate ladder combined with the application of a standoff stabilizer without any compromise to standard ladder safety protocol as a viable alternative. However, if you are determined to accept the risk of using your ladder at any angle less than 75 degrees, which is essentially a violation of sequence step number 6, then you would need to significantly increase the stability of your ladder at its base. If you are tempted to rest your ladder along any pitch less than 75 degrees on any home with standard eave heights, which is far from ideal. But let's say it was your only access option to reach the 512 pitch of this dormer valley. We would need to give some consideration not only for securing the base of our ladder, but also some additional support for the ladder's overlapping midsection. Let's keep in mind that a ladder's working load limit will always be based on its most vulnerable point, which would be at its midsection when it is fully extended, with the pressure points located at its top rung and shoe assemblies while positioned at the recommended 75-degree angle. For a Type 3 ladder, this would be 200 pounds. For a Type 2 ladder, 225. For a Type 1 ladder, 250. A Type 1A ladder, 300 pounds. And a Type 1AA special duty ladder, 375 pounds. But for the use of a ladder at any angle less than 75 degrees, we should understand that its working load limit will always be less than the manufacturer's duty rating, because the stress we will cause to its midsection from the working load that we will apply will always increase as our ladder's angle decreases from 75 degrees to 0. Just how much stress based on angle is uncertain. Therefore, we will need to mitigate this risk with an abundance of caution, which would mean to avoid the risk if at all possible. However, if we have no choice but to accept the angle less than 75 degrees, we should select the appropriate ladder, supplement the resistance at the ladder's base, and provide for extra support at our ladder's most vulnerable midsection. And that will complete our lesson on the physics of fall protection. Please make sure you join us for our 5th video on prioritizing ladder accessories. There we will dive into the tools we can use to supplement our ladders, to expand our individual capabilities beyond that of what we have already established for the safe access of residential roofing structures.